Hello and welcome back to Choices, Chapter 19. We're going to discuss the effects of domestic violence exposure on children. So, for today's class, I'm going to be leading you to a video about domestic violence exposure in children. But first, I'm going to cover a few important points. So, first, we'll talk about some of the overall effects of domestic violence on children. And there used to be a belief that children who were exposed to violence and trauma early on as young children, toddlers, babies, that they forgot about the memories and are much less affected by trauma than older children. But more recent research has shown that it's actually the exact opposite. So the younger the child is, the more vulnerable they are to the effects of trauma and exposure to violence. There's been a significant amount of research on very young children, babies, and even in utero that shows that even when a woman is pregnant and there is domestic violence or other forms of trauma, that the baby in the womb is affected in a number of ways. One way is that babies in the womb have the ability to hear and respond to their environments. Also show that when babies are exposed to trauma in the womb, they are born with higher levels of stress hormones, and part of the reason is that they are sharing the same chemicals as their mother. So when the mother is exposed to violence or trauma and has elevated stress hormones or other chemicals in her system, that in turn affects the baby in development. And when the baby is born, even though they are unable to speak and articulate and even recall memories, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that developing brain is very susceptible to the effects of trauma, and that children, as they grow up, having been exposed to trauma, often respond differently. So some children, just depending on their temperaments, their personality, the environment that they grow up in, they're likely to have different effects. One effect of the exposure of trauma or domestic violence is that the child may internalize their trauma, and internalize would mean that they take it in and direct it towards themselves. The other way, which is sort of the opposite, is that the child may externalize the trauma and their behavior is directed outward. So the child that externalizes trauma is more likely to act aggressively and for you to be able to see that in their behavior. Whereas the child who internalizes the trauma may take it upon themselves and act inwardly, may be more likely to develop problems like anxiety and depression, engage in behavior like self-harm, and maybe more at risk for suicide later. So same kids, same household, same exposure, you're likely to see very different results in kids just depending on their personality and how they respond. We know that children who witness abuse overall are at higher risk for different kinds of behavioral problems, including problems at school, problems learning, problems with memory, problems forming relationships, mental health issues, and may be more likely to be involved themselves in abusive relationships as adults, either as the victim or perpetrator of abuse. So you're going to be watching a video that provides a lot more information about exposure of domestic violence on children. But one very important takeaway from this video is that there is nothing that's permanent that's done in terms of damage to the brain or for children growing up. So even if exposure has happened in the past, even if kids have been through a lot and witnessed a lot, you have the ability to stop this process and change the trajectory of your children's future. We know this because the brain itself is considered to have plasticity, meaning that it changes. So when the environment changes and children are exposed to something different, it literally helps to reshape the wiring and the processing in the brain. So if you're watching this now and you know that your kids have been exposed to trauma and seen a lot, and you want to make a difference, you have the ability now by simply stopping the behavior. It will immediately begin to alter this process, and all of these risk factors that you're going to hear about, the likelihood of developing these risks will go down. So your efforts to create a different environment can dramatically improve your child's sense of security and well-being, and literally change the wiring of their brain. So through this course, you have made decisions to behave differently and choose different responses. You are impacting your kids as well. And keep in mind, this means if you are still in the relationship, it also means if you have left the relationship. One common theme that people do is they take a volatile relationship. They know that it's not good for their kids to see conflict and fighting, so they break up, only to continue the conflict and fighting now in their co-parenting relationship. So going from a volatile marriage to a volatile divorce and volatile co-parenting relationship, with kids being back and forth and hearing negative things about the other parents and witnessing ongoing fighting even in the divorced stage. Be mindful of this now. You have the ability to reshape your children's brain, change the trajectory of their outcomes based on your decisions. Let's talk just briefly about where you can go for help if you recognize that your kids have been subjected to some trauma, have seen some abuse, and maybe seeing some signs that they're not coping well, and you want to get some help to, again, help change that trajectory. Some signs to look out for would be kids who are behaving aggressively, a lot of irritability or mood dysregulation. They can't quite regulate their mood, anxiety, difficulty forming relationships. These would all be indicators that it might be a good idea to get some professional help, which is available to you. If you are in San Diego, you can contact Fleet and Family. You can also contact your case manager to ask about services. We do have child therapists who specialize in this area and are able to provide services. So you'll see a phone number here for our San Diego centralized scheduling. If you're at another Fleet and Family location, you can reach out to them as well. Another option might be going through TRICARE, your child's pediatrician or medical providers, to see what resources are available. So our therapists are available to provide wellness screenings where they're simply assessing the child and seeing if there is indication of trauma and what suggestions might be made as far as treatments. We have therapists that can see kids individually, and we also have family services if that's something that might be helpful to you. So reaching out, getting help is another important step that you can take to help reshape this trajectory. Let's talk about this video that you will be watching. Unfortunately, our system doesn't allow us to just play it directly. So the way we can do this is by going to YouTube. There is a video, it's called First Impressions, Exposure to Violence in a Child's Developing Brain. So one option is just to go to YouTube and type this in, first impressions. The other is to just hit this link. You'll have to copy and paste it. This link will also appear on the homework assignment. And all of the homework questions are coming from this video. I want to go over the questions just briefly for chapter 19. Number 1 is explain why a young child's brain is more vulnerable to the effects of trauma. Number 2, the video discusses children who are exposed to verbal hostility but not physical abuse. How are they affected? Number 3, what can be done to help a child who has been exposed to trauma? How can this change the child's development? And number 4 is your takeaway. So how can you apply the information from this video to your situation, including your children or future children, your own childhood? If you are a family member, say an aunt or uncle, and have nieces or nephews around, information might pertain to, or other close family that this information might pertain to. How can you apply this? So that is it for chapter 19. Again, you are going to YouTube and watching First Impressions, Exposure to Violence in a Child's Developing Brain to answer these questions.